In this video, I want to discuss Tolkien's service in the Great World War, also known as World War I, that lasted between 1914 and 1918. Now, I want to give credit to the book Tolkien and the Great War by John Garth, because much of the information I will be giving you in this lecture comes from his book, and I highly recommend it. It's by far my favorite autobiography of Tolkien's, so if you're ever interested in reading it, I encourage that. Alright, so World War I broke out in July of 1914 when Tolkien was 22 years old. Now, he delayed entering the service for a year, not because of lack of patriotism or anything, but because he needed to finish his college degree. By this time in his life, Tolkien knew he wanted to be an academic, and the only way he would be able to pursue that dream after the war would be to finish his college degree. So at this time, in education, there weren't programs like adult degree programs, or it really wasn't heard of to be able to leave college for a few years and then jump back in. That just didn't really exist, that ability. Once you started, you kind of had to stay with the track through. There wasn't really a way to be reintegrated back in. Now, when Tolkien was at Oxford for this year, he was virtually the only man left. Almost every single other person had signed up for service in the war. And you can see here is a picture of the cadets marching through the streets of Oxford at the time. Now, Tolkien married Edith right after he graduated and right before he was shipped out to France in 1916. Tolkien's role in the war was as a signals officer, okay, and he was put with the 11th Lancashire Fusiliers. So this person would be responsible for communication between the troops and command, and would also be involved with cryptography and coding and decoding messages. So this image over here gives you an idea of something that Tolkien may have done and kind of the type of apparatuses they worked with. But a signals officer could have used things like Morse code, telephone, could have used runners, carrier pigeons. We don't know exactly what type of systems Tolkien did, but that was his job. So his job wasn't primarily to fight, but that doesn't mean that he didn't see combat, because he was often very close to the fighting. From the book Tolkien the Great War, we learn that the communications cable didn't usually reach all the way to the front line, or all the way to it, but beyond its reach, soldiers worked in a zone of mystery. So the job of the signal officer was to shed some light on the mystery by helping to set up a battlefield communication system and using it. So Tolkien's job would have been to take what was happening at the front line and report that back to command, which could be in a nearby town, maybe even further away, or even all the way back to England would messages be relayed. So this was the way for, the higher-ups in the military to know what was going on at the front line, who was winning, who was not, where were supplies running low, things of that sort. Now, one of the battles that Tolkien fought in was the Battle of the Somme, which was also known as No Man's Land, okay? So if you've ever seen pictures of World War I or know anything about it, it was very much a war that was fought in the trenches. It was known for its trench warfare of these long, thin little tunnels about a man wide, the sandbags and the barbed wire, and that was the common sight. Now, Tolkien was at the Somme between July and October of 1916, although not directly on the front line. He was very close and only a few miles from it, so he would frequently see the wounded being carried back. The Battle of the Somme was one of the largest battles of World War I, and it was primarily fought between the British and French against the Germans. And the British suffered some of the heaviest casualties in that fight, and it is still one of the bloodiest battles in human history. About 3 million men fought, and about 1 million men were killed or injured all around. So to give you an idea of where the Battle of the Somme is, here we have England and London in the south with the English Channel, and the River Somme goes right to the English Channel, and about here is approximately where the fighting would be. And you can see the front line here is this line in red. So sort of a fun little note, just because Tolkien was such a language person, we know that he knew Greek and Latin and some Finnish. He also knew German, and while fighting, he did encounter some German POWs, And Tolkien, knowing a little German, just offered one of them some water, and in doing so, he was corrected on his German pronunciation by one of the POWs. So that's sort of just a little kind of like fun fact that just shows Tolkien's kindness and also, again, his affinity for languages. Something to understand about the British military at the time is that there was a rigid hierarchy between the officers and the enlisted. So an officer was someone who was commissioned or had authority over others. Often the officers were educated or came from the upper class. Tolkien, as an orphan, was definitely not from an upper class. His family didn't have any real association with the upper class. They would have maybe been like upper middle class in a sense, his father, when he worked for the Bank of England over in Africa, but there was no titles or pedigrees there. Tolkien was made an officer because of his college education, most likely. Now, an enlisted person would have been any soldier who wasn't an officer, essentially, and those were often those from the lower classes. Now, having grown up in Birmingham and around the working class, Tolkien felt much more of an affinity for the enlisted men than he did his fellow officers, and he often wished that he was able to socialize with the enlisted men more than the officers. So the officers really were not encouraged to have much to do with the enlisted. They would eat their meals separately. There was very strict decorum of what was to be maintained socially. However, I will say that as World War I drew on, many men from all over England were kind of thrown together as, certain divisions and whatever were, dissolved and reformed and things like that. So there was more interaction between Englanders from different part of England and between the classes, but the hierarchy was still sort of there. Now I want to draw your attention to the image down here, which reflects a common part of warfare in World War I, which was marching and just moving from place to place. Tolkien was at the Somme for about 4 months, and during that time he had to move 45 times. So as you're reading The Lord of the Rings and kind of reflecting back on the continual marching and kind of walking aspect that's reflected in the whole story from the beginning, it's hard not to see how that might be very reflective of Tolkien's experience in World War I, of just the constant moving from place to place and just the mindless dredging on. Now, one other member of the British military that it's important to mention, because we definitely see this in our character of Sam Gamgee, that would be what's called the officer's servant, or the batman. Right, so the batman was a special soldier who was assigned to be a servant to an officer. This soldier would often do domestic chores like cooking, laundry, things like that, to free up time for this officer to do the more important leading tasks. This batman could also run messages and possibly even fight in the war as well. A good batman often had to be resourceful, intelligent, and fit, and a good one would often earn a lot of respect from the fellow officers. So Tolkien says himself, "My Sam Gamgee is indeed a reflection of the English soldier, of the privates and batmen I knew in the 1914 war, and recognized as so far superior to myself." Now, we should also reflect on the fact that Tolkien, many of those in Tolkien's circle, his friends who he knew, also fought in World War I. In fact, when he was in school before college, kind of as a young teenager and earlier, he was at Edward's King's College, and there he made 3 other friends, Rob Gilson, Geoffrey Smith, and Christopher Wiseman, and they formed a semi-secret club called the Tea Club and Barovian Society, or TCBS for short. So, to put it simply, this is kind of like an early form of the Inklings, all right? These boys would gather together to discuss literature and whatever, else is on their hearts and desires. Okay, and this is a common theme throughout Tolkien's life. He almost always has a group of men around him with a literary bent who have a desire to publish and change the world through their writings. And that was very much the goal of these men. They had a lot of youthful gusto of, we're going to go out and change the world with what we have to say and what we're going to write. Okay, there was no small ambitions with these 4 young men. All 4 did enlist in World War I, and many letters were exchanged between them as they fought, and they occasionally did get to see each other on the battlefield when they were overseas. So up here you can see a portrait of Christopher Wiseman and also of Rob Gilson. So in one letter that Wiseman wrote to Tolkien, he says, "Fortunately, we are not entirely masters of our fate, so that what we do now in this war will make us the better for uniting in the great literary work that is to come, whatever it may be." So many see this as a bit prescient of the work that Tolkien will go on to write that will be the most famous of anything that is published by them, or really of almost anyone in World War One. Now, in one very touching letter that Smith writes to Tolkien about a month after Wiseman wrote the previous quote that I gave you, he writes this, which is very touching, and we do see that Tolkien does go on to write his letters. And if you ever watch the movie Tolkien, there's a very touching moment in the movie with this letter. But we see where Smith says, "My dear John Ronald," and that's how all of Tolkien's friends and family referred to him. "Publish by all means." And here Smith is referring to some poetry that Tolkien was sending out to different magazines and trying to get published. And that was very much a common thing done with writers at the time. He says, "I am a wild and wholehearted admirer, and my chief consolation is that if I am scuppered tonight," he means if I die, "there will still be left a member of the great TCBS to voice what I dreamed and what we all agreed upon. For the death of one of its members cannot, I am determined, dissolve the TCBS. Death is so close to me now that I feel, and I'm sure you feel, and all the 3 other heroes feel, how impressant it is. Death can make us loathsome and helpless as individuals, but it cannot put an end to the immortal 4. Yes, publish. Write to Sidgwick and Jackson, or who you will. You, I am sure, are chosen, like Saul among the children of Israel. Make haste, before you come out to this orgy of death and cruelty. May God bless you, my dear John Ronald, and may you say the things I have tried to say long after I am no longer there to say them, if such be my lot." So shortly after Smith writes this letter to Tolkien, he does die in combat, as does Gilson. So by the end of the war, Tolkien famously at one point says he lost all of his friends in that war except Wiseman. But eventually over time, him and Wiseman, their relationship fizzles out due to disagreements over the TCBS and just kind of worldview. So the war was very devastating for Tolkien. You can imagine going through something like that, and how would you feel if you lost all of your friends, many of whom, were like family. You have to remember Tolkien is an orphan. He didn't necessarily grow up in an orphanage, but he pretty much grew up in school, and he did board with a woman, and he was very close to the priest who kind of became his guardian. But essentially, these men were kind of who Tolkien had in his life as his family. Tolkien's unit was eventually pulled out of the Somme in October. Before they were sent out, Tolkien contracted trench fever, though, and was separated from his unit and sent to convalesce at the Duchess of Westmoreland Hospital. His unit was next sent to Flanders. Flanders had multiple battles fought there. Over 800,000 men would die. And very devastatingly, only 16 men from the 11th Lancashire Fusiliers were left alive. So that gives you a sense of how devastating that battle was. Now, I've never been able to find out exactly how many men were stationed within the 11th Lancashire Fusiliers, but my best estimated guess is between 3 to 800. Now, if you look at the image, you can see that this is what's called the no man's land within Flanders Field. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of how devastating the war was to the landscape in World War I. A lot of times now we're used to seeing more pictures of urban warfare with buildings, but in Tolkien's time it was very much battles were fought out in fields. And, not to say they weren't in cities also, but much of what he saw was with nature. So you can see all the trees, how they are just literally, the bark is stripped off them, they're blown to bits, the craters in the earth, and just the devastation is very reflective of what we see when going to Mordor and getting closer to that land. And Tolkien does say that the Dead Marches and the approaches to the Black Gate or the Morannon owe something to northern France and the Battle of the Somme. So again, you can just see here kind of how the land would almost look diseased and decayed just from the destruction. Now, One thing I do want to is to make a little bit of a connection to maybe prior literature classes you've had and just some things that you see. But around Memorial Day, you probably see the Lions Club or Rotary or whoever handing out those little red poppy flowers. And those poppy flowers usually come from a famous poem that you may have studied in high school in English class, On the Flanders Field by John McCrae, that was written here. Now, in doing some of my research, I learned that Flanders Field was not necessarily known for being very fertile ground before World War I, but it was because of the bombardment of the artillery shell and the chemicals there, and just literally the death that happened there, where bodies would be left there for weeks, kind of decomposing, that actually fertilized the ground and made it some of the most fertile that we've seen in a while. So it's kind of that cycle of life of through death, there is kind of then a rebirth and life that comes. And if you remember the poem that maybe you learned in high school, it goes, "In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below." Okay, so I just want you to kind of make the connection of how we're still sort of reflecting on Flanders Fields and recognize how deadly that was from way back then, but also in how this did have an effect on Tolkien's writing and does come up, and how we see so much of the land being diseased where great battles were fought, like in the Dead Marshes, and also that the closer you get to the evil of Mordor, the more the land is destroyed and the more the land reflects that evil and that destruction. Alright, so now to switch from war to post-war, okay, and how England recovered from World War I. In fact, though some would say England didn't really ever recover from World War I. But to give you a little bit of context, England was considered the leading world superpower at the time of World War I. So England's about the size of Oregon, although they have a much greater population and are more densely populated. So imagine the state of Oregon being the world superpower at the time. Now, all of us have lived in a world that has mainly been dominated by America as being perceived as a superpower, but that was not the case for Tolkien in his lifetime. Very much England and the British Empire were considered the superpower. Now, the cost of the war for World War I had a devastating effect on England. It cost them about $3.2 billion, and I believe that's in dollars of that time, not our time. 2 years after the war, Britain had a major recession, and Britain is still paying back its war debt from World War I. So that is over 100 years ago. So that maybe gives you some idea of how economically devastating the war was. And you have to think, too, 20 years later, Britain again fights World War II, and that has further devastation on their economy. Over 750,000 men died in the war. That is almost an entire generation. Even though Britain has a bigger population size, if you were to imagine almost 250,000 men dying in Oregon, you get the sense of how devastating this was. Sensing England's weakness and drop in power, many of the colonies under British rule around this time started to revolt and gain independence. India would be a famous example of that. So there were colonies breaking away before and after this point, but just as America's star kind of started to rise after World War II, and we emerged as the superpower after that, around and after World War I, England's star sort of started to sink. Now, this I'm pointing some of this out to give you some context for Birn's article, which you'll read this week in the forum. Now, Birn's mentions a couple words that I want to point out. One is scour. Now, the title of the second to last chapter in Lord of the Rings is Scouring of the Shire. So to scour means to clean abrasively and to be rough and hard, okay? So Birn says in his article, the Scouring presents a Shire quest of equal moral importance to the Ring quest of the trek to Mount Doom. The Shire quest possesses the same moral stakes as the Ring quest, but applies them to daily life and to circumstances that the hobbits have to address for themselves. So what that means is that what all the hobbits have learned in their different battles, like with Helm's Deep and at Minas Tirith, and even going into Mordor, they're now having to take all those lessons and apply them back in their own homeland of what to do with the Shire, okay? And that's mainly what Burns is going to get into in the article. A couple other terms and ideas to watch out for are his use of the word novelistic. What he means by novelistic is a story that shows relationships between different social classes. And a novelistic story will often focus on domestic issues, meaning relating to the home or the nation, so kind of very locally. And there's also going to be a focus on the rising middle class. Now, we can see this through some of the politics in the Shire with the mayor, the thane, and the sheriffs that comes up. Also, Sam is the only one to marry and establish a home, so the Shire is really only interested in events within its borders. So there's kind of an isolationism present in the Shire. And then Sam rises from the lower class to mayorship. All right, a couple other things that I want to point out is recovery from war, and basically what is meant by reintegration. Okay, this is sometimes a word we don't always hear a lot. Most stories end with the victory of evil being defeated, but don't show the recovery effort. It's just like, oh, the evil's gone, we're instantly all back to happy and normal. But there's no showing of how do you kind of get back to normal, and is normal even possible after experiencing so much hardship and trauma. There's often a focus in movies of the happiness that comes from the victory, but not sort of like the day after the happiness of, okay, well, things changed, but really did anything change? Because I still am having to deal with some of the difficulties and situations, and I'm still having to live with that past. So Tolkien really shows us through this chapter how people respond differently, and the different experiences that those who went off and fought have versus those who stayed behind and were isolated from what those who went out and fought experienced. Okay, and there's kind of this conflict that's a bit present in the Scouring of the Shire chapter. So Burns also gives a good quote that I think points this out. Necessarily, it is this very provinciality that Frodo and company went into peril in order to protect. They would not want their people to know all that they have known. To preserve ordinary life is why Frodo and Sam made the sacrifices they did. So what Burns is getting at is those who went off and fought made a sacrifice to keep the horrors of what they faced from those back home, so that those back home could remain almost like in the idyllic or pure state from which they left, so that that way of life could be preserved at the sacrifice of what the soldiers had to experience in battle. And that is sometimes not always something we immediately think about now, but during World War I, there was a bit of a difficulty for the soldiers coming back home being reintegrated into society. World War I definitely shook up the world in a way that hadn't happened before with any other conflict. There's a reason it was called the First World War, and that the soldiers weren't fighting, within England. They were sent out usually to France and fighting for England on foreign soil. And so they experienced a much wider world than any of them would have ever been exposed to. Many of them would have never even left England. In fact, it'd probably be very rare to travel forward and abroad. Not maybe overly rare, but it was not something everyone could do. So the war really opened up their horizons, and they also experienced horrors that had not been seen yet by the world at that point in war. So these soldiers were returning home with a lot of experiences, and there was not the understanding of PTSD and things that we have now. So there were many difficulties of being reintegrated. So kind of as you're reading, through Lord of the Rings and reading Burns' articles, kind of keep that in mind of what is Tolkien maybe saying about reintegration in the Lord of the Rings. All right, that's all I'm going to say in this video. We will continue with this discussion in our class session and also in the discussion forum.